Seminar, everyone will notice we're doing something a little bit different today. Today's seminar is hosted by CAFE. For those of you unfamiliar, CAFE is an interdisciplinary multi-college research initiative here at UCR, and its goal is to help build bridges among diverse talent in food and agriculture at UCR. This is the fourth lecture in a series of seminars on sustainability, and one of the interesting things is that each one of these seminars has been hosted in a different department. So today's seminar is hosted here in entomology, and I'm going to pass it off to Quinn so that he can introduce our speaker today.
Yeah, so we're really excited to host Ashley Larsen because her research is a perfect fit for CAFE's mission. Ashley is an assistant professor. We're just chatting about how her tenure file's in the works right now at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. She received her BS in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from the University of Michigan, and then got a master's in economics at UC Santa Barbara, and then a PhD in Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Biology at UC Santa Barbara. Her research interests center on ecology of managed systems and combines insights from ecology with causal inference and GIS tools to better understand how to produce the necessary food and fiber for a growing population while maintaining healthy ecological and human communities. So perfect research focus for a CAFE seminar. Her current projects focus on the landscape determinants of ecosystem services and disservices, particularly related to agricultural pests and pesticides, the biodiversity impacts of agricultural intensification, and the ecological drivers of land use transition. She held a UC President's postdoctoral fellowship in environmental science policy and management at UC Berkeley before joining the Bren School in 2016. And we'll turn it over. We're very much looking forward to your talk, Ashley.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the introductions. Let me just get my screen share going. Okay, hopefully you all can see that. Great. Oh, I should get my timer going too so I don't yak on. Okay, so I really appreciate the invitation. I'm thrilled to get a chance to talk to all of you, even though we have to be virtual. And if you have questions, feel free to interrupt. I'm sort of used to that sort of model. If you prefer to hold them to the end, that's fine too. So today I'm going to be discussing ecological drivers of agricultural pests and pesticides. I'm going to start out giving a quick overview of global agriculture before touching on my research program really as a means to seed potential collaborations. I'll then dive in to talk about the local and landscape drivers of insect pests and pest control based on data from Kern County, which is the backdrop to this slide here, and then a couple other things. But let's get going. So disentangling the local and landscape determinants of agricultural pest control. Oops, maybe. So agriculture, as many of you are aware, covers about 40% of ice-free land. And as such, it has an enormous influence on both human and natural communities worldwide. So in the past 40 years or so, right, the development of high-yielding crop varieties in combination with the widespread use of irrigation, fertilizer, and land use change enabled a near doubling of agricultural production. And this increase in production is credited with reducing poverty and improving nutrition for millions worldwide. However, there are numerous environmental and human health consequences of these intensive production practices and land use changes that have been and continue to strain both agricultural and surrounding natural communities. At the same time, demand for agricultural production is increasing due to both a larger and a wealthier population that tends to demand and waste more calories. And so the challenge, right, for scientists and policymakers is how do we meet the food and dietary needs of this growing and wealthier population, the least impact on natural systems. And so, as was mentioned a minute ago, my research is really motivated by this overarching challenge of balancing human and natural system needs, and is primarily focused on how we increase production on the current agricultural footprint while reducing the environmental and ecological harm from production practices. And my research has, we can break it down into about 3 interrelated pillars of inquiry that are sort of fuzzy boundaries here, but for clarity. And so I'm going to discuss this first one on the landscape determinants of ecosystem services and disservices. Right, I'm mostly going to focus on 2 recent papers related to the drivers of pests and pesticides in Kern County, and briefly touch on a third that zooms out to the US. Before doing so, I'd just like to give you a taste of some of my other work to illustrate potential areas of overlap. And so the second pillar focuses on the biodiversity impacts of agricultural intensification. And so here I address questions related to on-farm practices, how sort of farm size and field size aggregates up to impact biodiversity, right, and environmental quality. And so, for example, I've investigated how spatiotemporal variation in pesticide use affects natural communities, right? We might think about this as where and when high levels of pesticide use occur and how that overlaps with important areas or important time periods for biodiversity, right? And so here's one illustrative time series of monthly pesticide use by crop, where it's evident that there are fairly consistent peaks and troughs in pesticide use, but that these peaks are offset by crop, right? And so almonds in gray and carrots in dash black, right? And we're looking at a monthly time series between 2005 and 2017 of pesticide use being kilograms per hectare. And you can see there are these discrete and distinct peaks for each crop. You might be able to tell that these peaks roughly are evenly spaced for each crop, right? About the same time of year. However, they're offset such that almonds peak when carrots are low and vice versa. And thus we might expect different environmental impacts throughout the year, depending on surrounding crop composition. And in fact, we do see this. So the overlap of high biodiversity areas with high pesticide use areas shift throughout the year. And so here we're looking at the spatial distribution of high pesticide use areas, in particular the top 10th percentile for pesticides of particular toxicity to birds, as well as the top 10th percentile of bird species richness. And so we see hotspots of pesticide use move around in space and number as the year progresses from January to May to September, which results in the location and the number of hotspots moving as well. And so what we're looking at in these figures, we have the top 10% of bird species richness areas in blue, right? And then we have these hotspots of pesticide use in January, May, and September. Those are illustrated in red. And then the dark blue are areas of overlap, right? And so we can see that the areas of overlap change in location and number throughout the year. This has implications for thinking about how hazards from pesticide use manifest month to month, and when hazards might overlap sensitive life history periods or migrating species, right? And when there's not much overlap. Okay, the last pillar considers the ecological drivers and impacts of land use change. And so, for example, how meeting new groundwater sustainability requirements might affect the location of long-term fallowing or abandonment, and whether we can think about incentivizing the location of abandonment, let's say, to meet water savings and provide habitat for biodiversity. And so here we basically showed that meeting water savings was relatively inexpensive in terms of land set aside and foregone crop revenue. And there was a good amount of biodiversity benefits that were obtained, even if we just focused on water, meeting the water needs most efficiently. However, if we want to meet biodiversity targets completely, the costs grow dramatically as low-value croplands were insufficient in area and location to meet biodiversity needs completely. Okay, so that just gives you a sense of some of the work that I do. Today, I'm going to dive into work in this first theme, and in particular, focusing on the landscape determinants of pests and pesticides. Right, so we're basically asking the question, what are the ecological drivers of agricultural pests and pesticides? And I focus on pests, right? I don't have to explain this to the crowd, but because pests destroy about 1/3 of potential crops, and thus reducing loss to pests, right? Reducing crop pests is one important means to increase agricultural production on the current agricultural footprint. Further, as a consequence of pest damage and risk, right, farmers apply a substantial amount of pesticides. So global expenditures on pesticides are around $56 billion a year, which equates to the use of about 2.7 billion kilograms of active ingredients. So while pesticides enable the production of a larger and more stable quantity of crops, right, there's also substantial evidence of negative effects of pesticide exposure for numerous ecological taxa, right, birds, mammals, amphibians, bees, as well as air and water quality and human health directly. Okay, so what drives pests and pesticides, right? There's a lot of different angles we can think about this, but from an ecological perspective, insect pests, which are really the focus of much of the ecological literature, are driven by population demographics, species interactions, and movement, where we think about the outcome of high pest abundance, high pest damage, or the response to high pest abundance or high pest damage being higher pesticide use. And since the movement of insect pests between fields or between natural areas and cropland is thought to be highly influential to insect pest abundance and damage, right, for many crops and many insect pests, much of the ecological research focused on reducing insect pest damage has tried to understand what local and landscape characteristics could provide natural pest control via predation by natural enemies or by limiting pest population growth. And in particular, there's been a large emphasis on the importance of so-called complex landscapes in provisioning natural pest control and limiting insect pest abundance, or conversely, that simplified landscapes have more pest problems. So landscape simplification is somewhat of a loaded, jargony word, but basically it's the trend towards large-scale contiguous agriculture, right, with low crop diversity, large fields, and limited natural habitat. And complexity, as it sounds, is the opposite. And so this can occur at different spatial scales, right? At the local scale, complexity in the form of smaller fields with higher edge to area ratios is thought to promote the spillover of natural enemies, while if we zoom up to the landscape scale, land cover and crop diversity are thought to limit pests by limiting the size and contiguity of food resources. And thus simplification at both scales may result in increased pesticide use to reduce pest damage that was basically previously controlled by ecological processes in complex agroecosystems. And conceptually, right, this is rooted in two sort of foundational theories in ecology, right? The enemies hypothesis and the resource concentration hypothesis, both of which suggest as landscapes get more simplified or less complex, they have increased pest pressure and thus resultant insecticide use. Theory also yields valuable predictions about the stability of pests and insecticides. In particular, the diversity stability hypothesis suggests more complex landscapes may have reduced variability in insect pests and insecticides. Despite sound theory, right, the empirical evidence has been fairly equivocal. And so 3 reviews of landscape scale empirical studies found equivocal results, with some studies reporting higher pest diversity and pest abundance in simplified habitats, while others find the opposite. And my early papers on this topic reflected the same thing. I found huge variation in the relationship between landscape simplification and insecticide use. No, I don't show it here. I see this both over time, which is this figure, and over space as well. So this is a dated paper at this point, but we're looking at a series of cross-sectional models evaluating the relationship between landscape simplification and insecticide use in different census of agricultural years, which are on the x-axis. And what we can see from the left panel and perceive in the right panel, which are a series of panel data models, including year, county, and year and county dummy variables, is that year effects are really important, right? We see the coefficient shift from being negative. Landscape simplification decreases insecticide use, contrary to theory, to this positive relationship. Landscape simplification increases insecticide use depending on year, right? And when we account for these year shocks over on the right-hand panel, right, we find a null relationship. So this result was really surprising at the time because of sort of the sound theoretical foundations, and led to a lot of effort by myself and others trying to understand why. And this included a succinct group where again, we couldn't sort of nail down many universal rules. And these papers represented more or less a conceptual and empirical evidence of a high degree of ambiguity in the effects of landscape simplification on pests and insecticides. So part of the challenge of this synthesis effort is that we were limited by the body of work that had been done in the decade prior, which is largely based on field studies, use the sort of extent of cropland as their singular metric of landscape simplification, even though it was increasingly thought that configuration mattered. Further, given the variability in pest and enemy arrival, weather, among many other sources of annual variation, right, field approaches might have difficulty teasing apart signal from noise, may have difficulty capturing some of the nuances in how different components of landscape simplification affect insect pests, insecticides. Right? Nevertheless, so we have this big ambiguity in the field with sort of difficulty sort of nailing down what's happening. That's somewhat still true, right? But given the evidence of environmental harm, policymakers are sort of getting ahead of what we have, I'd say, good science for, right? Particularly in EU, policymakers have set remarkable goals for reductions in pesticide use on the order of about 50% by 2030, right? Without, I'd say, as much understanding of the system dynamics or how to achieve these reductions effectively as we might like. And it's really hard to fill these knowledge gaps, right? Because pest data are often sparse. We have very few detailed surveys at large spatial scales over large time horizons, just due to cost and feasibility. If someone in the audience has a long-term data set they're sitting on, wondering what to do, I would love to talk to you. Please get in touch. But in general, I found it in long-term, large spatial scale, it's cost and feasibility make it quite difficult to have many of these data sets preserved. Similarly, insecticide data are often aggregated spatially and temporally, right? And so both make it really difficult to account for the various dimensions of pesticide use decisions like farmer risk or environmental preferences, crop-specific vulnerability, value, as well as various crop-specific pests or year-to-year shocks in weather, technology, etc. And this isn't just a US issue, it's really a global issue. And so the research I'll talk about for the rest of today tries to dig in to try to understand what's behind the ambiguity in the literature on landscape simplification, insect pests, and insecticides, using finer scale understanding of these local and landscape characteristics and better accounting of farmer behavior, crop-specific characteristics, and other intricacies of this system. Doing so requires detailed data on both production and insecticide use, which, as I mentioned a second ago, is really hard to come by. One of the few places this data exists is in Kern County. So Kern, as I'm sure you all are aware, is in the southern San Joaquin Valley. It's one of California and the US's most valuable crop producing counties and grows a variety of high value, high insecticide use crops such as almonds and grapes. So I've illustrated here just the distribution of crops, major crops in 2005 at the beginning of the study period. As you can see, it's quite diverse, right? It's also quite extensive. The most common crops are crops like almonds, pistachios, grapes, alfalfa, cotton, though far over 100 different types are produced. And the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner's Office collects field level data on crop and ownership for all permitted fields. In the study I'll discuss, we're going to look at 2005 to 2017 for a total of about 150,000 field year observations. Now, critically, they also collect field by day pesticide use information. So this data includes information on the amount, the date, and the type of pesticides applied. And these are required by state regulation, right? The very few counties make this field level data publicly available for this long time horizon. And so using these data, we're going to address 4 hypotheses for what underlies the equivocal empirical results, and then extend the analysis to provide one of the first large-scale tests of the diversity stability hypothesis in agricultural systems. Okay, so let's walk through what these hypotheses are, and then I'll talk through the methods and results. So the first hypothesis was that the mismeasurement of complexity may be masking different relationships between landscape characteristics and insecticide use. In other words, basically, maybe the proportion of area in cropland alone, which is the common metric, is a poor measure, right? Maybe it just doesn't capture landscape simplification. And so here we expanded our landscape metrics to include crop diversity and field size. We're thinking about field size as being inversely related to the amount of edge, our ecotone. The second hypothesis for the ambiguous literature is that crop type or farmer pest control behavior may be correlated with characteristics of simplification. And so we're basically focusing on the potential for farmer behavior or individual crop planting decisions to bias the naive relationship between landscape characteristics and insecticide use. So for example, if low insecticide use crops are planted in more diverse regions, then we would observe a correlation between diversity insecticides that wasn't due to diversity reducing insecticides, but to non-random planting decisions. Okay, the third is spatial location, right? So the basic question is the spatial location of surrounding agriculture or diversity important to the magnitude and direction of the relationship? In most of the previous analyses, simplification was measured as a fixed area, right? And so we're asking here if basically the relationship changes over space in ways that could confound prior analyses. Okay, lastly, what if the effect of crop diversity in these other metrics are highly crop specific? Then the focal crop type and local crop composition may drive the equivocal results. Okay, in a second paper, we additionally tested if complexity drives the stability of insecticides and reduces the positive semi-variance or basically unexpectedly high observations of insecticide use, right? So the idea being that while diversity stability might be of ecological interest, what the rest of the world probably cares more about is not just, does diversity reduce the variance, but rather the unexpectedly high insecticide use occurrences. And so we'll look at both here. And though these hypotheses were developed and tested in two different papers, as you'll see in a minute, we essentially had to repeat the analysis from the first paper in order to test these last two hypotheses. So I'm just going to walk through methods and results for the second paper. Okay, so sort of corresponding to the hypotheses I just mentioned. So first we began by taking the spatial distribution of fields and measuring the proportion of area of surrounding cropland and crop diversity within a 2.5 kilometer buffer, right? We also noted the size and crop type of the focal fields. So this is just a basic illustration, right? There's a group of fields, right? These red dots are the centroids, basically drew a 2.5 kilometer buffer around each centroid and looked at what was inside. Okay, second, right, the potential for selection. So here we compared analyses, pooling all observations over space and crop type with analyses including a combination of region, crop, or farmer-specific dummy variables. This effectively results in the coefficient being identified from within farmer or within farm or within crop variation in insecticide use. The basic idea is we're trying to compare insecticide use, let's say on grapes with high surrounding crop diversity to grapes with low surrounding crop diversity, or between fields in the same farm that have different surrounding landscape characteristics. Okay, next to evaluate spatial scale, we measured the proportion of area in agriculture and crop diversity in annuli of 500 meters out to the 2.5 kilometer edge. So if the bullseye is the centroid of the field, we basically measured surrounding cropland extent and crop diversity in 5 rings out to this 2.5 kilometer edge, include 5 covariates for each diversity and cropland extent to basically allow for that flexible relationship between these characteristics over space. Okay, and lastly, we're going to rerun the analysis for each of the top 5 insecticide use crops, which account for about 90% of insecticide use, to allow for both the unique slope and intercept by crop. We also added the remaining 2 top 5 crops by area, which were alfalfa and cotton, such that the crop-specific analysis accounted for greater than 50% of actively cultivated cropland. Okay, I'm just going to illustrate the basic idea of our statistical approach. So we followed a 2-step generalized least squares procedure suggested by Justin Pope in the agricultural economics literature. I have a slide of equations that I'm happy to show and discuss the sort of details of the specification in the Q&A. But for now, just the basic idea. So the basic idea of Justin Pope was to estimate the effect of a technology on the level and variance or risk of production separately, basically by interpreting the heteroscedastic error term of the first stage as the risk of production. And so first imagine that we have the simplified version of our original model, right, where crop diversity reduces insecticides. Now envision the variance around that modeled line. So we're suggesting that while some of the difference between the expected, i.e. the line, and the observed, i.e. any one of these points, right, and the amount of insecticides is random, some of it is a function of landscape characteristics. So we're basically interpreting the heteroscedasticity as a metric of variability in insecticide use and suggesting it's a function of landscape characteristics. Further, if you just consider these observations above the line, right, these are our upside deviations or our positive semivariance, right? And so we're evaluating whether those, right, that distance above the line is a function of landscape characteristics. It's altogether not that different from a weighted least squares, right? That we're actually interested in this second stage. We're not just using it to improve our first stage. Okay, I'll stop there on that, but please ask questions if it's of interest. So the results. I'm going to take a minute to walk through these figures because it's quite a lot. So the three panels right now are illustrating the slope coefficient and the 95% confidence interval of cropland extent on the top, crop diversity in the middle, and the focal field size on the bottom. And the x-axis are the different model specifications, right? So first we have pooled OLS, ordinary least squares, where we've combined all observations together, right? And we've ignored any type of spatial or farmer or crop specific heterogeneity. We then have township in year, where township is the public land survey township, about 96 square kilometer region. We then have crop species in year, crop in year, farmer in year, and farmer plus species by year dummy variables. So this last model here, basically we're looking at the effects of landscape simplification identified from farmer specific deviations in landscape characteristics and insecticide use, right, after accounting for shocks shared by all fields of that crop in that year. Right, so that might be different technologies or different pests that specifically affected, say, oranges in a specific year, right? Okay, this first column is for the level of annual insecticide use, or that first stage of our two-step GLS. So we see, right? We see that more cropland extent and larger fields generally lead to an increase in annual insecticide use. Right now we're looking at the top and bottom figures, right? Diversity in the middle seems to decrease insecticide use, but it's clearly sensitive to model specification. This is a general trend, actually, where more stringent dummy variable controls, right, basically moving from left to right on our x-axis, right, attenuates the slope coefficient. It's particularly severe for crop diversity, where the pooled model suggests a 10% increase in diversity leads to about a 6% decrease in insecticides, which would be huge. Right? With farmer crop effects, that coefficient shrinks to between 1 and 1.5%. So we can interpret this decrease in magnitude as a tendency for low insecticide use crops to be planted in high diversity regions, and the tendency, because we see it for farmer in year as well, but the tendency for low insecticide using farmers to be in high diversity areas. Right? And both sources of selection bias are pooled results. Right? The coefficient attenuates further if we control for both farmer and species by year effects. So this far right coefficient. Okay, for the variance, we see somewhat similar results, right? The magnitude of the effects is about half the size if you note on the y-axis. So across specification, cropland extent, right? The amount of cropland nearby leads to an increase in the variance of insecticide use, as does field size. For crop diversity, we again see this negative effect. However, pooling or including regional dummy variables, right, we see a much larger coefficient, whereas including crop or farmer dummy variables reduces that coefficient substantially. Okay, and lastly, the positive semivariance or upside deviations in insecticide use. Here the results get a little bit noisier, right? We still see cropland extent and field size lead to an increase in these unexpectedly high insecticide use occurrences, right? The slope on crop diversity remains negative, right, across specifications, but as you can see in the middle panel, it's not significant in models with either farmer and crop species by year dummy variables. Okay, what about over space, right? So here we included covariates for surrounding cropland and crop diversity in 500-meter annuli out to that 2.5-kilometer edge, right? In our most stringent model, in the model with farmer and species by year dummy variables. And so focal field size is still in the model, but it doesn't vary over space, so it's not here. Not here being not in the figure. Okay, in the top row of graphs is cropland extent. In the bottom is crop diversity. And the different columns are, again, the level, the variance, and the positive semi-variance of insecticide use. And across the x-axis are these different annuli, right? 0 to 500 meters, 500 to 1,000, etc. Right? And what we see is, generally we see this large negative effect of cropland extent nearby. So in other words, nearby cropland reduces the level, variance, and positive semi-variance of insecticide use, holding all else equal, while cropland in the greater landscape increases all three. This is a surprising result that we're still trying to think through what could be behind this. We hypothesized that nearby cropland could limit source populations, right? While cropland in the greater annuli and in the greater landscape, holding all else equal, may signify a simpler landscape with a higher propensity for pest outbreaks. For diversity, we see somewhat mixed effects, right? The effect size is pretty small at all distances and is somewhat variable in direction over space. Okay, lastly, we looked at individual crop models because I imagine you're probably sick of looking at those panels. I'm just going to sort of spell it out. So while our prior models basically included separate intercepts for different crop years, these models allow for different slope and intercept, right? So a different relationship between landscape characteristics and insecticide use for each crop. So the effects on the level largely reflect the general pattern for all crops, though a little bit noisier. Across most crops, cropland extent and field size tend to increase the level of insecticide use, while crop diversity tended to decrease the level of insecticide use, as we saw previously. For variance and semi-variance, the results were more mixed. Interestingly, field size generally decreases the variance and semi-variance for high-use crops and increases both for low-use crops, so for alfalfa and cotton. And so in thinking about this, we're thinking that maybe large fields may limit biocontrol, but they also represent a larger extent controlled by one actor, by one farmer, right? And that may incentivize greater investment in pest control and pest scouting that might reduce variation in application, right? Our results hint that the ecological mechanism of large fields limiting biocontrol might be stronger for lower value crops, right? While these social or economic mechanisms may be more salient for high value crops. The effect of cropland extent on the variance and semi-variance is also a little bit mixed, right? With most crops showing significant positive effects, extent significantly increases the variance and semi-variance as we saw in the all crop model, but a couple showing the opposite. Okay, so I'm going to summarize our results related to these 6 hypotheses, and then I'll zoom out for a second. Okay, so first, cropland extent does not absorb the full effects of simplification. Rather, crop diversity, right, cropland extent, and field size are all influential. Now, I didn't show it here. Models with just cropland extent alone are often null or near zero. However, given the inclusion of all 3 covariates, right, cropland extent and field size are generally of larger magnitude, more consistently significant than crop diversity. Second, selection is key, right? So pooled models where we don't account for any regional or farmer-specific or crop-specific characteristics often resulted in substantially inflated coefficient estimates for crop diversity in particular. This was true for the level, the variance, and the semi-variance models. And thus, naively comparing insecticide use in different regions is likely to result in inflated estimates due to the tendency of non-random crop planting decisions and farmer specific pesticide use behavior. And so our results suggest that low insecticide use crops are planted in high diversity regions, right? And that lower insecticide use farmers also tend to be in higher diversity regions. Okay, third, the spatial location of surrounding agriculture is important, right? And as we saw, the relationship between cropland extent and insecticide use and the variability, right, actually switch signs as distance from the focal field increased. This could reflect source sink, ecological dynamics. It could also reflect something about farm ownership. And we're working on exploring both of those aspects, though I'm happy to hear other ideas. Okay, of importance, the magnitude, direction, and significance of the landscape drivers, the level, variance, and semi-variance of insecticide use are crop dependent, right? And so if you think about it, crop-specific relationships between landscape characteristics and insecticides are not all that surprising, right? These relationships would be expected to be influenced by characteristics of crop pests, such as their diet breadth and mobility, as well as other aspects that we don't think should be uniform across crops, right? However, as we think about how to use this information, it's important to note that the mean is often a little bit different than the crop-specific relationships. Okay, and though it's woven in the above, we emphasize that our results generally support the notion that increased diversity or complexity increases stability, and in effect, not just reduces the variance, but the variance associated with higher than expected insecticide use. And this is driven in particular by land cover diversity, more so than crop diversity. Okay, so how can we use this information? I think it's worth reflecting on the farmer decision, right? So reducing pest abundance and resulting pesticide use results in two classes of benefits. First, it reduces the cost of crop losses and pesticide applications, which are benefits that are likely to be at least in part incorporated into farmer decision-making. Second, it reduces negative environmental and ecological health impacts of pesticide use. And these benefits we might expect to be largely external to the farmer and may not be incorporated into decision-making in the same way. So given their seemingly private benefits to farms simplifying, right, and cost to consumers from landscape simplification, incentives could increase the level of ecosystem services towards a more socially optimal level. But changing landscape characteristics is, of course, no small feat. Right? So potentially spatially coordinating funding from agri-environmental programs could result in improvements to landscape complexity that are not currently achieved. And of course, the benefits, right, we might think, at least based on these results, are going to depend on specific crop types or crop composition. Okay, before wrapping up, I briefly want to address a question that I imagine to be in the room. That question is, can we scale up, right? After all, this is one county, and it's a county that looks quite different from many agricultural counties in this country. So, well, I'll just go through it, right? So what happens as we try to scale up? First, and most importantly, data resolution gets much worse, right? We must trade basically this field level information on pesticide use and farm and field characteristics for basically county level metrics. If we carefully try to account for county specific characteristics and time trends, right, how far can we get? And the answer is we can get partially there. So using various landscape metrics based on the National Land Cover database and farm and production details from the Census of Agriculture, we can isolate comparable relative effects of key local and landscape variables as in our field analysis. So we can illustrate again that cropland extent and field size, which is actually proxied here as contiguous crop pixels, increases insecticide use, and crop diversity decreases insecticide use, though the effect, again, of diversity is somewhat dependent on the model. But if we want to forecast, right, to understand future changes in insecticides, that necessitates expectations on changes in land cover, changes in climate, changes in agronomic characteristics like crop composition and farm size. That's, I think, really where the rubber hits the road. So we can scale up in present day, but as we move forward, our data limitations are become more apparent. And so we have projections, right, for land and climate, right? But crop composition and farm size are determined by a tangle of economic and cultural and social factors that are really difficult to forecast. As it turns out, these unknown variables are crucial, right? If we think about how important our climate is landscape complexity and these farm and other social factors, right? Let's think about the relative importance. It turns out crop composition and farm size are really crucial. So if we ignore those, if we assume that crop composition and farm size stays constant at 2017 levels and just forecast changes in climate and land cover, we expect roughly a 4 to 6% change in area treated relative to present day. But if we linearly extrapolate farm size and crop composition trends using historical trends from 1987 to 2017, right, we estimate a much larger change in treated area. And obviously, assuming no change and assuming a linear extrapolation are extreme assumptions, right, but filling this gap is really important. And thus, understanding the biophysical, local, and landscape levers is really only part of the story. In this case, the smaller part of the story than understanding how future crop composition and farm characteristics will evolve. And for the curious, because I couldn't leave it out, if we take the baseline model and we extrapolate crop and farm size characteristics, or we do this linear extrapolation, we see some spatially heterogeneous changes in future distribution of insecticides. So these big increases in parts of the Great Plains and Upper Midwest, and some decreases sort of scattered in the middle latitudes. The legend here is just changes in the thousands of hectares in 2050 relative to 2017. I'm happy to talk about the methods here as well. Okay, I'll wrap up. So our results broadly suggest that local and landscape complexity reduces insecticide use and increases the stability of insecticide use, largely reflecting predictions from agroecological theory. Right? However, stability seems to be primarily driven by decreased cropland extent and smaller fields, rather than by diverse crop types. Critically, many of these results hold when we control for heterogeneity unique to regions, crops, farmers, and year. They're often substantially reduced in magnitude compared to models where all observations are just pooled together, and are often substantially different in magnitude and sometimes even sign compared to models run for individual crops. And thus, underlying all of our results is this fundamental importance of accounting for unobserved heterogeneity unique to specific crops and farmers, right? Failing to do so results in severely inflated coefficient estimates for the average effects of crop diversity in particular. We saw it for our other landscape characteristics as well. So we conclude that landscape complexity can be an important driver of insecticide use and the stability thereof, right? But details like crop type and spatial location are likely underlying inconsistency in the empirical ecological research, right? And should not be overlooked in policies that are trying to leverage agroecological knowledge to reduce insecticide use. So with that, I'll just thank my collaborators, students, and funding sources, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
So if any of the attendees have questions, please feel free to go ahead and pop them into the chat and we will get them directly to Ashley. I'll ask a question, Ashley. It seems that you could kind of address, like, with these data, you could kind of address like farmers that are using insecticides just purely prophylactically, like just background rate of application, versus farmers that are applying them in a need-based kind of scenario, like there's pest pressure and that's when they use pesticides. And how, from your exploration of these data, like how often do those two scenarios play out and which one's kind of the most common?
That's a great question. And so what we see left over is about 20% of the variation in insecticide use. So if a lot of pesticides whether it's routine or whether it's just that by, mid-January, there's been enough pest pressure, fairly consistent year to year. That's probably not the case, but let's say June anyway. Let's say by mid-June, right, there's been enough degree days that there's enough pest pressure. We see roughly, this consistent peak that will occur for a given crop. If you take out the crop specific characteristics and you take out farmer, right, there's about 20% of the variation in insecticide use remaining. So a great deal is at least explained by something besides this year-to-year variation that's remaining. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
So a good amount, it's a great question. And we could drill down into which farmers, right, are more consistent. We haven't done that yet, but in terms of targeting farmers for outreach or something like that, it'd be a completely valid idea that we could figure out which are in sort of the most consistent group,
Right.
both in the level and we'd expect really low variance year to year.
Thank you. We do have a question in the chat, and it is, how was the baseline diversity data collected? Great,
thanks for the question. Well, I'll just answer it. So Kern and other counties as well, though not for the same time horizon, basically you can freely and publicly obtain a shapefile of fields for each year. And so what we did is basically look at each individual fields, right? And then look at the amount and the type of crop production within a buffer of 2.5 kilometers. For this study, we looked at, we calculated Simpson's diversity index of crop species. So the crop species nearby. In a previous analysis, we had looked at various different metrics, looking at the crop itself, looking at crop family, looking at sort of agricultural class, like leafy vegetables. And we found that crop species actually had the largest sort of diversity response, more so than let's say crop type. So that's basically how we moved forward with calculating diversity.
I have a question, Quinn, if you don't mind me jumping in. In one of the last slides, you showed the US states and kind of these differences over time are projected. Mm-hmm. And I was curious if you noticed any patterns in like crop type or adoption of organic, or if there were any patterns that maybe you're noticing in some states increasing or decreasing use.
That's a great question. So what we see, basically what's happening, right, is these different climate scenarios that we're envisioning in the future correspond to different land cover scenarios, much of it because of biofuels, right? So when we're projecting forward, we see these big differences, certainly in landscape simplification, like the amount of cropland in a county, it's often being driven by projections about biofuel demand. But that said, based on knowledge in California, I think if we looked at areas with higher crop diversity, like trends in higher crop diversity, particularly those that are moving towards higher fruit and vegetable content, right, I'd expect you see a big increase in insecticide use. And when we do those linear extrapolations, which if you have better ideas on how to get a more realistic assessment of future crop composition on all years, but that's where the big change comes in, is in the fraction of cropland that's in fruit and vegetables. So for organics, we don't really see that. We don't have county level information on organics for those sensitive agriculture years. So it's hard to project how changes in the trends of organics is going to affect pesticide use.
Are there any last questions from the attendees for Professor Larsen?
Yeah, I have a quick question. This is Carrie Malcolm in the entomology department here. And I was just curious, you were talking quite a bit about scaling up, but it seemed like there was less options for scaling down. That is, how much of this can be controlled or manipulated by the growers themselves to, reap the benefits of potentially reduced insecticide in the holdings that they control? It didn't seem like there was too many options for that. And I was curious about this point that the crop diversity, like what do you mean by crop diversity not mattering? Is that with regard to like using different cultivars and mixing different cultivars?
Great question.
Yeah.
So that's something that I don't observe, right? So what I observe is the crop type being grown, like strawberries or carrots or something like that. I don't observe, or grapes. So I don't have any data, basically. Kern doesn't publish any data on what the crop cultivars are. So there could be genetic diversity that I'm missing because I'm looking at, let's say, the amount of grapes nearby, but the grapes are really heterogeneous genetically. That is totally valid. What I'm talking about is with diversity, as close as we can come anyway to measuring diversity, is diversity of crop types being grown, not cultivars. So that certainly is a caveat. It's not necessarily that crop diversity isn't important. It seems to be less important anyway than land cover diversity, right? Than having some different types of, let's say, semi-natural habitat or something like that. And in terms of what farmers can do, I'd say field size is the most interesting result, right? And it's most consistent. We see field size leading to an increase in insecticide use. It really depends on where that's coming from. And I'm working with some economists to try to tease it out, right? Because if it's an economic driver that farmers say, if you're managing a postage stamp, right, and pests are coming in from your neighbors, then your incentives to deal with it, you're not going to be able to control your population, your pest population very well, and you probably are going to give up trying unless it's a really severe, a really, really costly pest because you don't have control. You spray, but they're just immigrating in, right? Alternatively, if it's more about edge, right, and spillover of natural enemies, that gives really different incentives to thinking about the placement of different fields or sort of land acquisitions, right, as well as things like windbreaks and things like that. So what's driving that field size observation is not yet clear, but I think that is going to be where farmers can do something.
Well, let's unless there's any more questions, let's give Professor Larsen a rounding virtual round of applause. I guess I said that really awkwardly. Virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, Dr. Larsen. Oh, it looks like Norm does have a question. You're muted, Norm.
You're still muted.
No.
Okay.
We can't hear you, Norm. I'm sorry.
We can hear you. Sorry.
If you want to put it in the chat, I'm happy to.
To get some virtual clapping going on.
Okay, I can pitch this question first that Claire asked. So she asked, is insecticide resistance taken into account in the estimates for changes in insecticide use in the US? So the answer is yes and no. So yes, in the sense that what we're basically doing is taking any type of adaptations that happen in sort of a conglomerate of counties. So any changes in how landscape characteristics affect insecticide use, right? In hot years and cold years, in hot counties, cold counties, or counties with more or less diversity, how that affects their trends in insecticide use, right? But going forward, we're basically then sort of building the model on present day and any adaptations they've done in present day, right? And then we're forecasting forward based on changes in land cover, changes in climate, and these assumed changes in crop composition, right? We're basically taking that difference and applying it to our present day model, right? And so we don't we aren't accounting for changes in technology that we haven't, or resistance, that we haven't yet seen in the last 30 years. If there's been increase in resistance in that period, then that's sort of wrapped in. But in terms of trends in future reductions, let's say in effectiveness, we wouldn't capture that. So in some ways, we might be underestimating how much future insecticide use is going to occur relative to today, if we think resistance is increasing.